A single mother goes missing from a hospital parking lot while her coworkers wait for her. Her car is found hours later burning in an alleyway. She is never seen alive again. For years after her disappearance, her family receives disturbing calls from a man claiming to be her killer. This is the case of Dorothy Jane Scott. So Dorothy Jane Scott was born to Jacob Scott and Vera Scott in 1948. She was a devout Christian according to her friends and family, and according to her brother, she was very, very caring of others. She would, according to him in his own words, give, no matter what it cost her. Now, at the time of her disappearance, she was divorced and she had a 4-year-old son. She and her son lived with her aunt, and she was also working at these jointly owned and operated shops. They were known as head shops, which sold drug paraphernalia. They were called Swinger Psych Shop and Custom John's. Whenever Dorothy was working, her parents would babysit her son for her. So weeks before Dorothy's disappearance, she started receiving phone calls at work, and these calls came in nearly every single day, and the caller seemed a little familiar to Dorothy, but she couldn't place his voice exactly. This caller would alternate between making declarations of love, detailing all the things that Dorothy does in her day-to-day life, or threatening her. In one incident, this caller asked Dorothy to step outside because he had something to give her, and when Dorothy did go outside, she found a dead rose stuck to her car's windshield. According to her mother, in another call shortly before her disappearance, the caller claimed that one day he would find her alone and cut her into bits. Of course, this call scared Dorothy greatly, and she highly considered buying a gun. However, she also considered the fact that her son could potentially find it and hurt himself. So instead of buying a gun, she instead decided to enroll in karate lessons. So in May of 1980, Dorothy attended an employee meeting at the jointly owned and operated shops that she worked at. Upon arriving, she noticed that a coworker's arm was red and inflamed, and that this man seemed to be feeling rather ill. So she decided that her coworker, known as Conrad Bostron, needed medical attention immediately. Dorothy, Conrad, and another coworker, Pam Head, headed out to the UCI Medical Center. Dorothy drove them there in her car, but first she stopped off at her parents' house to check on her son, as well as to let her parents know that she might be home later than she had originally intended. In addition to this, she also changed her scarf while she was there. As Conrad was being seen, Dorothy and Pam waited together in the waiting room. Doctors determined that Conrad had been bitten by a black widow spider and gave him a prescription. Pam and Conrad stood in line to get this prescription filled, while Dorothy went outside to pull up the car. When she went to go get the car, she first stopped very briefly at the restroom. Bostron and Pam walked outside to wait for Dorothy to pull up with the car. It had already been a few minutes, and eventually they do see her car approaching them. The coworkers claimed that they could not see who was driving the car because the headlights were on. The car was approaching them, and then instead of stopping, it continued to drive by them. They were unable to see as the car drove by them who was driving the car. Dorothy's car eventually leaves the parking lot. This whole incident confuses Conrad and Pam, and they decide to wait there for Dorothy to come back. However, after 2 hours and no sign of Dorothy, they finally call the police. Dorothy never returns to the hospital. She never picks up her son from her parents' house. She never goes back home. Her car is found hours later, burning in a Santa Ana alley. So a missing persons report is filed for Dorothy, and the authorities asked for Dorothy's parents to not go to the media with the story, at least not yet. A week later, a call came into the Scotts' house. Dorothy's mother answered the phone, and the caller asked if she was related to Dorothy before hanging up. 2 weeks later, Dorothy's father decides to take this case anyway to the media, and he does this through the Register in Santa Ana. The editing manager receives a call in which the caller claims that he had Dorothy and that he had killed her. This caller is able to give details that were not published in the official story. He was able to identify the color of scarf that Dorothy had been wearing, the scarf that she had changed into after changing out of the one that she had previously been wearing at work. So this is the scarf that she put on before going to the hospital, not the scarf that the rest of her coworkers would have seen her in. The caller is also able to give details about the bite on Conrad's arm, which was also not included in the published story. The caller claims that he is Dorothy's lover and that he caught her cheating on him with another man and he had to kill her. He claims that Dorothy called him from the hospital to let him know that she was there. Pam, however, discounts the story as she was with Dorothy the entire time until Dorothy went to go get the car, and as I said previously, she had very briefly stopped at the restroom before leaving the doors to go to the parking lot to get her car. Dorothy's father says that Dorothy had no regular boyfriends. He said that she worked from morning until evening and that she even lived with his sister. So there was no way that he wouldn't have known if she had been seeing somebody regularly, especially because they were the ones that babysat her son for her. Dorothy's son's father, Dennis Terry, was quickly ruled out as a suspect as he had called Dorothy's father that very day and had spoken to him, and this call came all the way from Missouri. In addition to this, Dorothy's father called Dennis Terry again later that night and spoke with him yet again. Calls to Dorothy's parents happened every Wednesday night for the next 4 years. Dorothy's mother always answered the phone, and the caller would ask if she were related to Dorothy, or he would say that he had Dorothy, or he would say that he had killed her. These calls always came in while Dorothy's mother was home alone and her father was out of the house. The last call, however, was made while Dorothy's father was at home. He answered this call, and the caller hung up immediately without saying something that he had never yet done to Dorothy's mother. This had been happening for 4 years, and once Dorothy's father answered that phone call, the call stopped for 3 months. Dorothy's remains were found on August 6th of 1984. They were found by a construction worker, and they were 30 feet off of the Santa Ana Canyon Road. Her bones were found scattered along with dog bones, hardly covered by dirt. The bones found were her skull, her pelvis, an arm bone, and 2 leg bones. There was also a turquoise ring and a watch found nearby. The remains were identified as Dorothy's through dental records and through her mother's identification of her turquoise ring. Dorothy's mother said that she felt relief that the uncertainty was over and profound sadness that her daughter was dead. Investigators determined that Dorothy's remains had to have been there for at least 2 years because they were slightly charred, and it was believed that this was the result of a brush fire that had swept the area 2 years prior to Dorothy's remains being found. Shortly after Dorothy's remains were found and the information was published in the media, 2 final calls came in to Dorothy's parents. In both of these calls, the caller asked, "Is Dorothy home?" before hanging up. This was the end of the disturbing calls being made to Dorothy's parents. Dorothy's death was investigated as a homicide. The cause of her death could not be determined by her remains. Police agreed that the man who had been calling and harassing Dorothy and later calling and harassing her parents was most likely her kidnapper and killer. The police did not believe that a customer could have been her stalker and killer because Dorothy worked in the back of the shops and she did not have any interaction with the customers. The police also questioned the employees of the jointly owned and operated shops on 2 separate occasions. In addition to this, law enforcement did attempt to tap her parents' phone to trace the calls that were coming in. However, those calls being made were too short and a trace was never able to be made. There is no decent forensic evidence in this case, and Dorothy's killer has never been identified. Recently, a blogger claimed to have interviewed Dorothy's son, who is now an adult. The son gave the blogger pictures of his mother. He also stated that one of the shops Dorothy had been working at had been previously owned by Dorothy's father before he sold that shop to the neighboring shop owner. According to Dorothy's son, there was a possible suspect named at one point. His name is Mike Butler, and his sister worked at the same shops as Dorothy. Butler lived in the Santiago Mountains, and he was supposedly involved in cult activities. In addition to this, he was also allegedly obsessed with Dorothy. Unfortunately, there is no more information on Mike Butler, and there was never enough evidence to make him a prime suspect. It is unlikely that Dorothy's disappearance had anything to do with robbery or a robbery gone wrong, as her car had been disposed of along with her ring and her watch. It is often asked whether or not there was any security camera footage at the hospital, whether it be inside the hospital or in the parking lot. And unfortunately, CCTV cameras were essentially only just really spreading throughout the entire nation in the early 1980s, and I was unable to find any information as to whether or not there were security cameras. There was also no information as far as police mentioning security camera footage. So unfortunately, we do not know if there were security cameras, but I would be willing to guess that there were not any security cameras present at the hospital when Dorothy disappeared. Some people believe that a coworker could have been Dorothy's stalker, and some people also believe that Dorothy could have been murdered by a coworker because she may have possibly stumbled in upon some sort of theft of money from the business, or possibly on some sort of drug deal in the back, and they may have wanted to get rid of her so that she couldn't reveal information to anyone. Some people go even further with the coworker theory, and they state that it was most likely Conrad and Pam, along with a third accomplice, who were stalking Dorothy and who decided to kidnap her from the hospital and murder her. I don't feel that this is a very likely scenario. It sounds extremely far-fetched to me. In addition to that, it's highly unlikely that 3 people would have been able to carry on stalking for that long and then actually kidnap and murder her, and to be able to keep it a secret, all 3 of them, to be able to keep it a secret. It's really difficult for people to actually do that. So I really don't think that that was the case. It also doesn't really make sense to lure Dorothy to the hospital so that they can kidnap her from the hospital, because the coworkers worked there and her father stated that she worked from morning till evening. She could have easily been kidnapped and killed on her way home from work, or she could have been taken from work. She worked in the back. Somebody could have potentially done this without having been seen, and they could have gotten back to work before anybody noticed. But I think that it's just a very far-fetched theory, and that it doesn't really make any actual sense once you really start to think about it. Some people also wonder why Dorothy hadn't reported the stalking instances, and I think that this has a lot to do with the fact that back in this time, stalking was not taken seriously. It was not an issue that you could go to the police for, and they would be gung-ho about it, and they would take the case on, and they would, interact with whoever it was that was stalking you, or even trying to find out who it was that was stalking you. If you didn't know, you couldn't just walk in and tell somebody, oh, well, someone's stalking me, can you make them stop? They would tell you that you're essentially out of luck unless you actually get physically assaulted. And the first stalking laws were not introduced in the United States until 1990. And I mean, this was 10 years before that. So there was really nothing that Dorothy could do. I wasn't able to find any evidence of police reports having been made. So I don't believe that she did go to the police. Her parents never mentioned her going to the police about any of this. But at the same time, I can't really blame her for not going to the police, because even if she tried, it's highly likely that she would not have been taken seriously, and that they would have not taken a report on it at all anyways. I personally believe that this last theory is the most likely. Dorothy did state that the caller's voice sounded slightly familiar to her, but she wasn't quite able to place it. In addition to this, all of the calls after Dorothy's disappearance were made while her father was out of the house. Now, some of you might be thinking that I'm about to accuse the father, and I'm not. I don't think that he had anything to do with this. That is another theory, but I also think that that's extremely far-fetched. The theory that I think is most likely is that Dorothy's father knew who it was. He didn't actively know that that person was the person stalking Dorothy, but he knew somehow the person who was stalking Dorothy. So when the caller called that last time before her remains were found, and Dorothy's father answered that call for the first time in those 4 years that this person had been calling, the caller immediately hung up, and that's not something that he had ever done when Dorothy's mother had answered the phone. So a lot of people suspect that somehow this person knew Dorothy's father, and that person was worried that if her father heard his voice on the phone, whether he was trying to disguise his voice or not, that he would be able to recognize who it was, which is why when Dorothy's father answered the phone, he, instead of saying anything, he immediately hung up. I honestly think that this is the most likely theory. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. It could have been somebody completely unrelated, unknown to anybody in the family, but I do think that that's definitely a viable possibility. Some people have also tried to link Dorothy's case to other cases that were happening around the same time, around, the same area. However, there's not enough evidence that really links her case with anyone else's. In addition to that, the specific calls that were being made to her and then to her family after she had disappeared, it highly suggests that this person was simply highly obsessed with Dorothy for whatever reason it was, and he was just solely obsessed with her, and most likely she is the only person that he has killed or that he has actually stalked and then continued to stalk her parents through phone calls. I do not think that the person who killed Dorothy is connected to any other cases that we know of, and especially not any of the cases that people have tried to link together with Dorothy's. It is unknown how long Dorothy could have potentially been alive after she was taken. It is possible that her stalker kept her alive for a period of time, but it's also just as likely that he murdered her after he had taken her that night. Jacob Scott died in 1994 and Vera Scott died in 2002. Both of Dorothy's parents died without having ever found out what had happened to their daughter or who had been causing them so much pain for so long. It is highly unlikely that any progress will be made in this case because of the lack of forensic evidence, and though it is unlikely that anyone listening to this video has any information pertaining to this case, I would still urge you that if you do have any information related to this case, that you contact police immediately. If you have any further theories on Dorothy Jane Scott's disappearance and murder, feel free to discuss them in the comments down below. Please remember to stay respectful of Dorothy and her family in the comments down below, and I will see you all again soon for another video. Bye.